Hello everyone, my name is Joy Barfoot. I am Education and Public Programming Officer here at the Rooms in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. I am delighted on behalf of the Rooms and the CBC to welcome you tonight in conversation with Gordon Jin to talk a little bit about Gold Mountain. Gordon was born and raised here in St. John's. He is the son of a head tax paying Chinese immigrant and a founding member and president of the Newfoundland and Labrador Head Tax Redress organization. Gordon is about to give us a lesson tonight on this important chapter in our local history. I should actually point out that at the end of the conversation this evening, if you have any questions, please leave your questions in the comments below, and we will certainly get some time to look at those questions afterwards. Thank you, Gordon, for coming in this evening. Let's start with the phrase, "in search of Gold Mountain." Where did this phrase come from? What is Gold Mountain, or where is Gold Mountain?
So Gold Mountain, thank you, Joy. Gold Mountain to the Chinese people during the latter part of the 1800s and early 1900s was considered to be San Francisco, in fact, but really it denoted North America, the land of opportunity where there was a lot of opportunity for work, the opening of the Western Canada and the Western U.S. with the railway, the mining of gold. So there was a lot of opportunities for the Chinese to come to Gold Mountain. So they searched for Gold Mountain, Gamsan as in Cantonese, or Gimsan in my dialect, Choisan.
Mm-hmm. So Gordon, Chinese have been coming to Canada since the late 1700s, and this year in particular marks the 125th anniversary of the first Chinese to come to Newfoundland. I'm just wondering, what brought the Chinese to Canada, in particular the west coast of Canada? What were some of the push-pull factors, if you will, that kind of helped influence their decision to come to Canada?
Yeah. So by the late 1800s, the railway was being completed, but what was happening, they needed Chinese laborers to complete the building of the railway. The opportunities for the Chinese people to come basically was such that they came in quite big numbers, obviously. Some of the push factors was basically farmland was scarce in China. People were starving. There was civil unrest. There was civil wars in China at the time. And, of course, due to the opening of some ports to European trading, there were loss of jobs to the local Chinese people in China as well, so they needed to move outside of their home country to find work. Mm-hmm. Some of the pull factors that bring them to North America, obviously what I said earlier, the building of the various railways, the mining of gold, various lucrative opportunities for them to find work and to make a modest income for their families.
Right. We know now that about 17,000 Chinese workers were recruited to build the Canadian Pacific Railway. And we know that following the completion of the railway in 1885, the Chinese Immigration Act was passed, and then eventually that was followed by the Exclusion Act. Gordon, what did these acts mean to the people who were living in Canada at the time, and what impact did it have on the families that were living in China?
Let me begin by saying that the Chinese Immigration Act caused numerous issues. First of all, when the act came in force, it was the Canadian head tax, the first Canadian head tax, which was the amount of $50 for every Chinese immigrant to come into the country. They still kept coming. And apparently by 1901, they raised that to $100 per Chinese immigrant, and they still kept coming. By 1903, it was $500, and they still kept coming. So between the 1870s to the early 1920s, there was an 800% increase in the number of Chinese people coming to Canada. What that caused was a lot of disgruntled Canadian workers obviously getting displaced because the Chinese workers were willing to take on the jobs for much lesser salary. But in fact, what it also caused was in order to come, you had to pay now a stipulated sum of monies that they had to find themselves, whether they raised in their home country or their friends in Canada raised and sent back to them. So there was a bit of resentment between the Chinese people and the Canadian workers here. Obviously, that culminated on July the 1st in 1923 when the government of Canada abolished the head tax, but then brought in the Chinese Exclusion Act, which really barred any Chinese persons from coming into the country between 1923 and 1947. What happened with the Chinese that were currently in Canada at the time, or even in the Dominion of Newfoundland, that really precluded these Chinese gentlemen or workers who had families back home from ever really getting their families over to Canada any reasonable length of time. The amount of monies would have been significantly large to bring not just a single family member, but 2 or 3 family members if there were siblings or moms and dads involved. I guess over the years, it's just aggravated to the point that many of the men that came to Canada or the Dominion of Newfoundland lived a bachelor society. They were here by themselves. So.
Okay. As mentioned earlier, I mentioned that this year marks a milestone. It's the 125th anniversary of the first Chinese arriving in Newfoundland. Upon arrival, many of these, and I'll say young Chinese men, because I think it was mostly men that came at that point in time, they opened up the laundromats, or the hand laundries especially at the time. What was it like? What was that daily life like for those young men at the time? And what were some of the challenges that they faced, both inside the work and then outside in the community?
I would imagine that life was very monotonous, laborious. I grew up in the late 50s, early 60s at the time when the hand laundries were starting to close up. So I had the opportunity to see the hand laundries, in fact, that were scattered in and amongst St. John's at the time. The work was very, very monotonous. It was basically washing clothes, basically applying starch, ironing, and it went on long days. There wouldn't have been a lot of opportunities for them to do any sort of socialization with their friends, but it was in fact something that they could do with very little setup of equipment. You know, the hand laundries were not a mechanized thing; it was all hand washed. So a lot of the things that the Chinese did, in fact, when they came to North America, was the hand laundries, really. So,
yeah. In one of the photos that we were looking at earlier, there was a map of all the hand laundries pre-Confederation, I think it was, in the downtown area. And I was really surprised at the number of hand laundries there. I think there were like in the 20 plus.
Yeah, there were laundries. 24 that we as our organization had identified. Yeah. The last one would have been the Snow White Laundry or on Aldershot Street, but they've now ceased to exist. I'm not even sure there's even a hand laundry left in North America now, but that was traditionally what many of the Chinese who came overseas did starting off.
Right. And what was it like outside of the work? Like what kind of challenges might they have faced outside of work?
I think they were probably discriminated against. I'm not sure, but my mom and dad would never talk about things of that nature. I think they kept to themselves. There were various clans, what I would call groups within the Chinese community in St. John's, and that's not abnormal. Any of the bigger cities that had Chinese community, there would be several groups of different families that formed different clans or societies, and that happened in St. John's as well. So they kept to themselves. They socialized amongst their various clans, and that's how, in fact, in some of the bigger centers, Chinatowns were born. Right.
Okay. You are Canadian-born Chinese. You grew up here in St. John's, and in an earlier conversation before we came live tonight, you mentioned that you grew up living in the shadow of two cultures. What did you mean by living in the shadow of two cultures? Can you share that experience with us?
Well, I mean, I'm Chinese by birth, but I'm really a Canadian by birth as well. But I never realized the various traditions that many of my Caucasian friends celebrated, because they weren't celebrated in my own household, because my mom and dad would celebrate the festivals and Chinese holidays, which it didn't sort of align with what I was taught in school, and my friends celebrated, like Halloween or Christmas or Easter. I mean, I would never be going on an Easter egg hunt. I would never go out on Halloween, because they were strange, customs to me. But I guess the older I got, I realized that was something that was just a festivity or a custom that Newfoundland or Canadian kids went to do. But we ate Chinese meals at home, but when we went outside, it was Canadian meals. We basically spoke Chinese at home, because my mom and dad would speak to me in their native dialect. So I learned Chinese at home. But when I went to school, I never spoke Chinese. So it was living two cultures, but in a society that was pretty well dominated by English.
Right.
So, yeah.
What was it like at school when you went to school with your classmates? What was that like for you?
It was different. I mean, I went to a small 7-day Adventist school system for many, many years until I finished junior high, and then I went from a school of a class of 6 students to a class of 400, so that was a bit of a culture shock. But I still remember when I was very young, growing up, my mom or dad would walk me to school, and we would be taunted by the neighborhood kids because we spoke different, we looked different. And I think part of that stems from intolerance and ignorance of different cultures and different races. I think it's gotten much better now over the years, but it was challenging at times.
I know you've been an invaluable player for the fight for redress, and probably since the early 1980s or the mid-1980s. On June 22nd, 2006, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper made an official apology to the Canadian head taxpayers. And then soon after that, Premier Danny Williams of Newfoundland and Labrador made an apology to the Newfoundland head taxpayers. What did this mean to you and the Chinese community? What did that apology mean, and what came afterwards?
I think that apology given by Prime Minister Harper was one of the biggest events within the Chinese community. It was a first step towards reconciliation, because the Chinese people felt they were wronged. We were the only ethnic group that was basically charged with a head tax. No other ethnic minority group were ever tagged with that. I think for many that waited for this, the wait was much too long. My parents were already deceased by the time that apology came, but it was a big step. I think the government did the right thing. This head tax was something that was instituted in the early part of the last century, policies that would be unacceptable in today's society.
Yeah. You are also a founding member. We introduced you as a founding member of the Newfoundland and Labrador Head Tax Redress organization here in the province. Tell me a little bit about this organization, and especially the Newfoundland Chinese Head Tax Education Program.
Sure. So part of the apology came with several different initiatives that the government of Canada wanted to do with groups in Canada in regards to wartime restrictions and immigration measures. Basically, under the Community Historical Recognition Program with the Department of Canadian Heritage, monies were allocated for various interest groups to apply for funding. You had to be a legal standing, so a group of head tax descendants, friends and supporters basically got together and determined that this was a great cause to be involved with. We got legal standing, and we basically applied for funding with a proposal. We partner with the City of St. John's and the Grand Concourse Authority as two of the major partners to piece together the Newfoundland Chinese Head Tax Education Project. And what it was to teach future generations of kids that are going through our current school system and the general public about what happened in Newfoundland at the turn of the century between 1906 and 1949, when Newfoundland or the Dominion Newfoundland had this racist and discriminatory legislation. It was there. We can't forget it was there, but we need to keep that collective memory alive that things like that can't and should never happen again.
Yeah. I guess one of the achievements, I suppose, of that the organization is the granite monument that's located just outside the City Hall Annex building.
Right.
Can you tell us? You were at that ceremony.
Yes.
You were a big part of that,
Right.
and
Right.
You were at that ceremony.
Yeah.
What was it like for you to be there and to see that come to fruition?
Yeah.
And just the whole feeling of the
Yeah.
people around you on that day.
I think so. That Newfoundland head tax education, Chinese head tax education project comprised the monument was the most visible thing. We also had a 9-month exhibit in the Center for Newfoundland Studies at Memorial University. There was also a website, and there was a educational resource kit that the Department of Education has right now. But the monument is the living legacy to those trailblazers that came to Newfoundland at the early part of the last century. I think it was summed up by a colleague who attended the event and said, it's unfortunate, but you've done your parents proud by what you've done today to represent the Chinese community in unveiling this monument. It's basically a memorial to recognize these people who really came from the other side of the world. My dad was 15 years old when he came to Canada or came to Dominion, Newfoundland. He spoke no English. He was already married at the time, and he left his family in China to come here to start a life. I think it basically honors their sacrifices, their separation from family for 24 years, and things that I think we really need to educate our kids, our grandkids about, so future generations know that this existed in the early part of the last century.
Right. Yeah, it's certainly a piece of history. Why the location there, though? What's significant about that location?
So that location was actually the site of the first Chinese hand laundry opened by the first 2 Chinese gentlemen that landed in St. John's in 1895. We wanted something that signifies some relevance to the Chinese head tax, and these 2 gentlemen weren't head tax at the time because they came prior to the 1906 head tax. Okay. But we felt that connection to the Chinese laundries and the head tax was such significant that we had to tie it to a location of a hand laundry, and the closest place that we could find at the time was the location that was actually Ronald Penny, the city manager of the city of St. John's, was the instrumental in helping us secure that location for our organization. So we thank the city of St. John's for that.
Well, thank you, Gordon, for sharing that story with us this evening. We'll open it up. I think we may have some questions from our viewing audience.
Sure.
I'm just going to check to see if we have any questions there.
Okay.
And my laptop just went offline. Just give me a second. It's timed out.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a couple of comments. Let's go down here. So we have a comment from Kelly Rogers, who says the story of the Chinese head tax in Newfoundland and Labrador is part of the grade 8 history curriculum. and students learn about the racist policies that were implemented by the government. And she thanks you for this interview this evening.
Okay.
So that's nice to know
Okay.
that it's certainly seeing it in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Here. Great. I'm not seeing any questions. Yeah. Here's a question from Marilee Pittman. She wants to know what has been written about the history of the Chinese in Newfoundland. Are there any books? Are you aware of any books that may be available?
I'm not aware of any books. There's been some PhD dissertations done at Memorial University by graduate students, so that's available through the Center for Newfoundland Studies, I'm sure. Our research was mainly focused on whatever periodicals information that we could find at the time, which was dating back to 2010, so there might have been more articles written since. But there are books available through chapters. I think it was on one of my slides for the presentation I gave last year that's available about the Chinese head tax in Canada.
Yeah.
So that book is available for purchase.
And we have another question from Rick Brown. Rick wants to know, how has this changed today? Is it a better environment today?
I think Newfoundland is a much better environment in terms of the mosaic of various cultures. Obviously, growing up in the 60s, it was predominantly white community, Caucasian. Now you're seeing different ethnicities, different minority groups from various countries around the world, atypical of what we would see in a bigger center, but on a much smaller scale.
Right.
So I think it's gotten much better.
Good. And here's a question from Justin Chow. He's wondering if Mr. Jin knew his grandfather. His grandfather was Harry Chow, and he used to be the head of the Chinese Society of Newfoundland and Labrador.
I might, but it doesn't sound familiar at the moment. Yeah.
Leanna Brittany wants to know how much was the head tax, and when was it abolished? And there's one more question. Were there any job restrictions or pay restrictions?
So for Newfoundland, the head tax was enforced from 1906 to 1949, and it was repealed when Newfoundland joined Confederation, so the government of Canada assumed all liabilities for the head tax. It was a $300 head tax, equivalent to about 2 to 3 years of wages at the time.
Wow.
The Canadian one obviously started in 1885, and it ran to 1923 when they abolished that one and instituted the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that varied from $50 to $100 to $500.
Wow.
Yeah, and 82,000 paid that tax.
Wow.
Yeah, compared to about 350 to 400 Newfoundland immigrants or
Right.
Newfoundland Chinese immigrants.
Yeah. Wow. One other question from B. Courtney. Are the pictures that you have available, or are the pictures that you have shown tonight, are they available anywhere?
These are pictures secured for the presentation for the rooms, so they are with written permission from the people that have them. They're not. Some of those pictures are not my pictures.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay. And let's see, we have one other question from David Sparks. What was the Chinese community like in the late 1970s? So you were growing up around that time period, and that's from David Sparks.
I think it took a lot of time. I mean, the Chinese community was one of the larger ethnic communities in St. John's. I think if you grew up in St. John's, you would have had Chinese food at many of the snack bars or restaurants in St. John's. they still exist, but many of these restaurants are now been taken over by bigger chains, not necessarily Chinese chains, but it was tough, I think. I mean, I went through grade school and high school and then university in St. John's. I think university, you're introduced to a different culture because at university there was a lot more nationalities involved.
Right.
And over the last number of years, you've seen this in various school systems now where a lot of immigrant parents have come over because they have professional jobs and their kids are in the school system. When I went through, I think my sister and I were the only non-Caucasian kids in the school.
Right.
Yeah, in the early 60s.
Yeah. And your dad had a snack bar,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that was in Mount...
No, that was Prince of Wales
Right.
Street in St. John's.
Yes.
And my uncle, his brother by 10 years younger, he had a snack bar in Mount Pearl, and
Right.
an icon of Mount Pearl for those that grew up in
Yeah.
in West, grew up in Mount Pearl. So,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
for many years.
Okay. And we have a comment from Janet Hong. This is, "Thank you, Gordon. This is important for keeping the history alive. As Dad, Mel Hong,
Oh, yes.
never told us much about this head tax, which I know that Grandfather Hong was required to pay."
Yeah.
So that's from Janet.
Yeah. Thank you, Janet. I knew your dad, Melvin, and I knew some of your family siblings as well, and I do this to honor their memory for many of the Chinese immigrants that never had an opportunity to tell the story, and the story will soon cease to exist because many of the head taxpayers, there were 4 remaining Chinese head taxpayers in Newfoundland when the apology occurred. Every one of them are now passed away. So it's left to the head tax descendants to now carry that torch and that story. So I'm very honored to be given that opportunity to tell this story today.
We had a conversation earlier, a few days ago, about a head taxpayer that lived in, I'm not sure, Toronto. And she was
112,
12
I think.
years old.
Yes, Hei Fulam. So she was a wife of a Chinese head taxpayer in Canada who paid the $500 head tax to come over, and she was separated from her husband for many, many years. There was a nice article written in Globe and Mail about her. She lived a life of separation for many, many years in China until her husband raised enough funds to bring his wife and kids over. But obviously, her husband passed away. I don't know at length of time, but she wound up eventually in a OH home. And due to COVID, you know, I really, really think COVID has done a number on many of the seniors. And she lived much of her life alone, and she died alone in an OH home due to COVID or complications from COVID. So it was a very sad story. She was quite an activist in the Chinese community. Yeah.
125 years is certainly, it's certainly been a long journey.
Yes.
And again, on behalf of the rooms, I just wanted to say thank you for coming in and sharing your story this evening. And I want to thank the CBC as well for making this conversation possible. And of course, thanks to all of you who are watching this evening live. Thank you all. Stay safe, and we'll see you again next time.